this introduction. So please, Mr. Guru, you can start.
Yes. Thank you, Aparna, and very good evening to all of you. Even as I'm getting into this webinar and wanting to share some of my thoughts on the topic that has been chosen today, I'm reminded of this little piece of writing that I went through a couple of days back. A very interesting piece where the author is pointing out that the lockdown because of COVID has brought in a new form of communication between people. Because of the physical lockdown, people are not able to meet each other, but this desire and the urge to keep communicating is so basic and fundamental to humans that new art forms and new forms of communication have come into being. And interestingly, he compares this with what is called samizdat. Somebody might ask the question, what is samizdat? Samizdat is that form of publication which was undertaken by writers back in the Eastern European bloc belonging to the Soviet Union, where there was complete censorship in that era. Typewriters had to be notified to the state. Whatever people had to write had to go through this scrutiny and censorship of the state. And therefore, there was a complete clampdown. So to overcome all of this, people used to engage in what is called samizdat, where essentially they would self-prepare, self-publish, self-circulate to overcome the censorship. Now, I think these webinars are really a reflection of that kind of initiative taken by the entire human race. It's really very, very commendable of the Madras Tax Bar and various other organizations and individuals who are coming up with this. Of course, the context is totally different. The samizdat context was something totally negative. Here, the clampdown is because of a pandemic which has threatened the entire human race, as it were. People are therefore compelled to be under lockdown conditions. They are not able to interact with each other. They are not able to get out and carry on their activities in the social realm as normally would take place. But the fact that people have come up with this concept of webinars, where you see hundreds of people congregating on a daily basis. In fact, I understand it is 2 sessions, one in the morning and one in the evening, where they are spending their time usefully by discussing issues of legal topical interest. I think is something which is clear reflection of the resilience of the human spirit. So much for the introduction that I wanted to give, because I really believe that this is an excellent initiative which is taken, and hopefully this will continue in the days, months and years to come. Not that the clampdown or the lockdown should continue, but at least these efforts must continue. In fact, I have always for one felt that continuing professional education is a dire necessity in this country, because it's only continuing professional education which will help hone the skills of a professional. The more and more that someone is caught up in the day-to-day work, the more and more someone is engaged and bundled up, as it were, only in the regular targets of the day of meeting clients, making presentations for a particular case, preparing for a particular case, rather than focusing on larger issues, perhaps at some stage might result in saturation of legal knowledge. So to that extent, this is something which is very important, and I really hope that this clampdown has the collateral benefit and effect of institutionalizing this kind of participation and congregation of people. Now, having given you this introduction, I thought I should first tell you very broadly what I propose to do now in the evening in the next half an hour to 40 minutes. First, what I intend doing is outlining a few of the prominent and important constitutional doctrines and principles. They really are the bedrock or the cornerstone on which the edifice of a discussion on how the scheme works and what the law is and how the Supreme Court has approached the issue will become relevant and will also be useful. So that's what I propose to do to start with. Thereafter, I intend very quickly discussing with you some of the important cases where directions have been issued by the court for conduct of floor tests. What was the factual backdrop to those cases? What was the reasoning of the court in taking a decision to direct the floor test to be conducted? And what exactly was the constitutional imperatives which the court thought had to be the basis for issuing such directions, so that will give a clear idea of the rationale and the reasoning behind the orders passed by the court. And based on the discussions, I propose to place before you certain issues and perspectives so that perhaps it will be appropriate for the participants to think about and reflect upon the issues which I believe are very germane and may be useful for future consideration of the issue as and when it arises. Now coming to the fundamentals, the constitutional fundamentals. The first principle which I want to highlight and to be borne in mind is the system of governance that we have in this country. Many of us, being experienced lawyers, have come across that, would have seen it in all its ramifications and width and amplitude. But nevertheless, I think it's very important to recapitulate the basic principles. The form of governance that we have given to ourselves under the written constitution is the cabinet form of government. What is this cabinet form of government? Cabinet form of government is that system where you have a council of ministers headed by the prime minister at the central level and the chief minister at the state level. Now, it is this cabinet which actually runs the day-to-day governance of the state and the country. This is very generically called the executive. Now, where is this drawn from? As obviously everybody knows, this is drawn from and out of the legislature. The legislature being the collective body of all the persons who are elected either in the general elections or in any by-elections, and from and out of them, the persons who constitute the majority group, whom we call the political party which constitutes the majority, they form the council of ministers. Now, whom are they responsible for? That's the next question. Are they a power unto themselves? Obviously, the answer is no. This council of ministers is accountable to the legislature because they owe their existence to the legislative body. This concept is very, very briefly and compendiously referred to as collective responsibility. So please recall, the cabinet form of government is what we have given to ourselves. It consists of an executive which is drawn from out of the legislative body, and it owes its existence and duty and responsibility and accountability to the legislative body. Now, when I say it owes its responsibility and commitment and accountability to the legislative body, am I ruling out the right, or for that matter, the responsibility of the elected government to the public at large? Obviously not so. The public get together to elect the body which comes into being as the executive, as the council of ministers. But that responsibility which they have to the public, very, very poignantly speaking, is something which takes place at the time of elections. Any election of a particular political grouping or a particular political party is on the basis of certain ideologies and certain principles and values and certain goals which they claim and project to the public they would pursue if they are voted to power. Of course, this is something which is a very theoretical formulation of the position. Now, having pointed this out, we need to look at a few other things. Is this all the structure? Obviously not. We have above these people, or as part of this structure, the President of India. Where does he stand? We have also the governors of the state entities at the federal level. Where do these two functionaries, constitutional functionaries, fit into the scheme? Now, these officers, these functionaries, namely the President of India and the governors of the states, are the executive or the titular heads of the executive government. The President is the titular head of the Union of India, of the executive government at the union level, while the governor is the titular head or the executive head at the state level. Now, there are provisions in the Constitution dealing with all of these. I'm sure it will be detention of unnecessary time if I were to take you chapter and verse through these provisions. Suffice it only to point out that there are specific parts and chapters in the Constitution making provision for executive being brought into being, how the president is elected, what the qualifications are, so also how the governor is nominated, etc., etc. I will refer to how the governor comes into the picture, because when we talk about floor tests, the position of the governor is something which becomes extremely important. This is one part of it. Now, I was mentioning about this cabinet system of government. One aspect which is very important to be noted is this: how does the cabinet function qua the president at the union level and the governor at the state level? As I was pointing out, this cabinet system of government is really a broad adaptation of the Westminster system, which is being practiced in the United Kingdom, which we have adapted for our own requirements and purposes with some modifications. Now, how does all this function? There are some Supreme Court judgments dealing with all of this. I think the best way this position can be encapsulated and placed before you for ease of understanding is this. I need to do no more than refer to Justice Krishna Iyer's felicitous expressions in Samsher Singh's case. He asked himself this question: do the Rashtrapati Bhavan and the Raj Bhavan really equate to or are equal to the Buckingham Palace or the White House? Or are they in between both? And ultimately, adopting the Riverian imagery, he says, neither the Potomac, it's not the Potomac, but the Thames which fertilizes the Yamuna. Meaning to say, the system that we follow is not really the American system, because when he talks about the Potomac, he alludes to the American system. And when he talks about the Thames, he talks about the British system. And he says, we follow more nearly the British system. So that is broadly the cabinet system. Now, having mentioned that, I was telling you about the president and the governor being the titular head. Let us now look at what the role of the governor is, because as I said, the role of the governor, at least insofar as decided cases are concerned, the role of the governor has come into very, very sharp focus in all these cases. The manner in which the power has been exercised, and the manner in which the courts have dealt with the exercise of power by the governors, and the reason why ultimately floor tests were ordered. Now, the governor, as I said, being the titular head, is nominated by the President of India. Now, the President of India, being the executive head, functions on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So it really does not call for any great hypothesis to note that the appointment of the governor is really in substance and in effect by the party in power at the center. Now, question will arise: is this something which is right? There is another important aspect. The Constitution provides that the governor shall have a tenure of office of 5 years. But at the same time, it says that he shall hold office at the pleasure of the President of India. What is this pleasure doctrine? This is where it becomes very important to note how brittle, if I may use that expression, or tenuous the existence of the governor is. Somebody might ask the question: if someone who is as tenuous in his tenure and who is really at the mercy of the party in power at the central level, can he effectively be the executive head of a federal unit? Will it not raise the question that the concept of federal autonomy will be seriously undermined? These are very, very poignant and pregnant questions. These questions have repeatedly arisen for consideration. In fact, there were very elaborate discussions and debates in the Constituent Assembly. There were members who very strongly advocated such a system not having to be incorporated into the Constitution. In fact, referring to the Government of India Act, they said if we were to have something similar to that, then it will have serious repercussions on federalism. Ultimately, in fact, there was one person who, even though he supported the system as was projected and what was prevalent under the Government of India Act, he even went to the extent of conceding that it may be undemocratic, but ultimately said this is something which is required because the provinces, which is what they were referred to, the states were referred to at that stage, were still not in a position to really govern themselves independently, and therefore it was necessary. But then, how did the constitution framers think it appropriate to ensure that the office of governor does not become a tool, as it were, to engage in political witch hunt, or for that matter, to engage in games of political attrition? The simple recipe they thought of was this: it is necessary that there are persons of eminence, there are persons of learning, there are persons of large amount of experience in public life who should be made governors. One important recipe was, they said, please think of persons who are as apolitical as possible. Now, this is so far as the Constituent Assembly is concerned. Now, what the actual practices, what has been the experience is another part of it. And when I get into the case law, we'll look at some of the facts of some of these cases, which are a little striking to say the least. Now, therefore, the governor functions at the pleasure of the President of India. Now, considering the nature of office held by the governor and the fact that it is at the pleasure of the President of India, a writ petition was filed in the Supreme Court saying that there has to be some kind of modulation of the constitutional principles. They need to be read down in such a manner to ensure that the exercise of the pleasure by the President of India is not something which is arbitrary. Now, what is important for the immediate purpose is what was argued by the Union of India in that case. That shows very, very interesting discussion and debate on the drift of how the entire matter is considered at the state level and central level at every stage in the running of the country. It was sought to be argued that the governor is someone who functions and continues at the pleasure of the President, and therefore, if any of the actions of the governor or the decisions taken by the governor are out of sync, this was the expression used, are out of sync with the ideals and the policies of the central government, then it will be open to the central government to look for a change of the governor. Mercifully, the Supreme Court said, no, that argument cannot be accepted. At the same time, the petitioners who had challenged the manner in which the office of governor was being run or the appointment was taking place and the change was being done had argued for various provisos or conditions to be brought into the exercise of power, including guaranteeing in the normal course of 5-year tenure, but subject only to certain conditions being followed. The court said those cannot be accepted. In fact, the court referred to the Constituent Assembly debates. The court referred to various other aspects, including the report of the Committee of Governors. It referred to the Sarkaria Commission report. It referred to the committee which was formed to look at a relook at the working of the Constitution, and said there is a necessity to continue with the present state with certain directions. Now, in so holding, what the court really spelled out as the role of the governor and the position of the government is governor is what is important for our immediate purposes. The court, firstly, with reference to earlier decided cases, said the governor is not an agent of the central government. That's very important. And as I already said, the court said he cannot be removed simply because he is out of sync in the perception of the central government with its policies or goals which it wants to achieve. Therefore, this is one important finding the court gave. Now, while looking at the office of the governor, another important aspect the court looked at. The court looked at how there are really 3 types of offices under the Constitution. There is one category of offices which are held at the pleasure of the President of India or the appointing authority, as the case may be, and there is no security of tenure. Under that come the category of governors. Interestingly, Attorney General at the national level and the Advocate General at the state level, as also ministers in cabinets. A second category is the category of persons who are appointed but can be removed subject to conditions being satisfied, as for example, a civil servant. Persons covered by Article 311 and 310 of the Constitution of India, where even though they are appointed at the pleasure of the appointing authority, but then their removal can be subject only to following certain conditions. Then there is a third category, persons who cannot be removed but for following a certain procedure, immediate reference being made to persons like the judges or other office holders who can be removed only by the process of impeachment. Therefore, the court said that a governor is someone who falls in the first category, but then it is important that there is no arbitrary exercise of power. Having said all that, the court said the governor rises above politics and he acts as a bridge between the state and the center. This is very, very important. These are some of the important takeaways, if I may say so, from that judgment. There's one other interesting aspect. There was some years ago, almost 20 years back, if I remember right, an issue raised whether the governor can be the sanctioning authority for prosecution of, let's say, a minister or a chief minister. And he being the weakest link in the constitutional scheme, will it be appropriate that an elected member is subject to the prosecution of an elected member is subject to the sanction of such a person? In fact, that question, if I remember right, was referred to a constitutional bench, but it's not very clear what happened. Perhaps with the lapse of time and the passage of time, it has become infructuous. Now, having mentioned about the role of the governor, how does the governor function? I pointed out about the cabinet system, how the governor acts on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. Now, there is also an exception to this. Article 163 of the Constitution says the governor acts on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, save and except those matters which are by or under the Constitution reserved for the discretionary decision making of the governor, which is where a lot of debate has occurred. There are decisions and debates on what are the subject matters in respect of which a governor can function independently without reference to the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. There are a number of judgments bearing on them. Perhaps it may not be appropriate to detain everybody's time on the nitty-gritty of those judgments, but then this is a facet which has to be borne in mind when I'm talking about the cabinet system of government and the governor in that scheme. Now, moving on, I spoke about how the executive is drawn from and out of the legislature and how it is responsible to the legislature. Now, this responsibility of the legislature is something which takes place through the confidence that is enjoyed by the majority grouping in the legislature, which is where the floor test becomes extremely important. How does one come to know that the party in power or the coalition or the group in power enjoys the confidence of the legislature? Whenever there is any doubt that a government has ceased to enjoy the confidence of the House, the floor test becomes extremely relevant. Now, what is this floor test? The floor test is nothing but an exercise and a device by which the majority and the numerical strength of the political grouping is tested on the floor of the House. Now, in fact, two concepts are extremely important in this regard. There is what is called the vote of confidence. All of us would have come across two expressions very repeatedly. One is vote of confidence, the other is no confidence motion. What are really these two? Are they different? What is the implication of each one of those? Very simply stated, a vote of confidence is what a ruling dispensation seeks and obtains before the House, whereas a no confidence motion is a motion, as the name itself suggests, something which is moved by an opposing group saying that they have no more confidence in the government and that the party in power or the grouping in power no longer enjoys the confidence of the House because of the drop in the numbers. Now, vote of confidence conventionally is something which is taken by any government which is sworn in immediately after elections take place, and the governor calls the majority party to power within a certain stipulated time at the shortest possible. In fact, the first agenda of the government which is sworn in is to get the confidence of the House and then start doing its work. A no confidence motion, on the contrary, takes place during the running of the House. These are broad principles that I'm talking about. There are certain exceptions, but broadly, to put in place the framework that I want to discuss, this is all that may be necessary for the present purposes. Now, having spoken about this, we then move on to another extremely important functionary in the scheme, the Speaker of the House. This is the other important constitutional functionary who needs to be clearly kept in view while discussing the constitutional scheme and the floor test law which is laid down or which is directed by the Supreme Court from time to time. The Speaker, in very, very simple terms, is the commander of the House. The Speaker is elected from amongst the members of the Legislative Assembly or the Parliament, as the case may be. The Speaker has the power to run the House. He has the power to conduct the proceedings. Of course, all of us today have the benefit of watching live proceedings of the Parliament and some state legislatures wherever it is possible and permissible to the limited extent. And there are various provisions dealing with the Speaker. Once again, the chapter and verse of the Constitution is there in front of you to look at the specific granular details of how the Speaker is elected, how he functions, how the House is conducted, etc., which perhaps may not be necessary for the immediate purposes. Now, therefore, I have spoken to you about 2 or 3 important principles which have to be borne in mind because they are the cornerstone on which the discussion on the main topic will take place. 1, the cabinet form of government. 2, the collective responsibility of the cabinet. Number 3, the position of the president at the central level and the governor at the state level, and how the governor functions, primarily being on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. And number 4, the Speaker in the scheme. Not to talk of how ultimately collective responsibility, which is the basis of all this, is the continued enjoyment of confidence of the ruling party in the Legislative House. Having said this out, how does the court come into the picture? Now, all of us remember very vividly those rudimentary lessons which we learned in law school, talking about separation of powers and how the Indian Constitution provides for separation of powers. There is no doubt about the fact that the 3 organs of the state, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, are supreme and sovereign in their own realm, in their own sphere of activity. The legislature makes law, the executive implements them, and the judiciary oversees and ensures that there is compliance with the constitutional and legal requirements. Now, having said that, is it a situation where we have a very, very rigid separation of powers? In the sense that if some party is said to have lost the power in the House, and therefore the majority of that party or that grouping has to be established in the House, the governor or the Speaker, or as the case may be, there is a demand for conducting a floor test, or there is some dispute about that. How does the judiciary come into the picture? Are they not independent bodies where they are all functioning and working in airtight compartments? No, the answer is obviously in the negative. The judiciary ultimately has the power under the constitutional scheme to say that certain actions taken by the other coordinate wings of the state are either constitutional or unconstitutional. Does it mean that the judiciary is supreme? Does it mean that the Indian Constitution provides for judicial supremacy? My response to such a query will be this. The correct formulation is the Constitution is supreme and the judiciary is the final arbiter in terms of deciding what the Constitution provides for and whether any action taken by any of the constitutional functionaries is within the bounds of the Constitution or is otherwise unconstitutional. We have come across this expression, sentinel on the qui vive. The Supreme Court being the sentinel on the qui vive. This was something which was referred to way back in 51, 52, if I remember right. And interestingly, it is this position of the judiciary being the sentinel on the qui vive being repeatedly invoked by the court in various decisions to say that there has to be a floor test conducted when it ultimately directed conduct of a floor test in some of these decided cases. Therefore, the judiciary is ultimately the final arbiter, and there are cases and cases. In fact, if I may say so, the cases are legion on how the judiciary is the final arbiter. I'm reminded of one very interesting observation by Lord Denning himself in UK. Talking about separation of powers, please remember, all of you will recall, the United Kingdom does not have a written constitution. Their concept of judicial review is something which is not exactly same, though of course we have adopted some of their principles, but in the sense that they don't have a written constitution. They are slightly different from India. Their functioning and working of the judicial system, their judicial review are all to be understood in the backdrop of that position. Their constitutionalism to that extent is something which has to be compared and contrasted with India. From such a background, Lord Denning, when speaking about the preeminent positioning of judges to be vested with the right to judicially review actions of any other organ of the state, says someone has to be trusted and let it be the judges. This is how the position was formulated by Lord Denning. In fact, Frankfurter, that famous judge of the US Supreme Court, had this very, very forthright and compelling words. He said, judges with their training, they are far better disposed to be able to decide whether some action is constitutional or not, rather than the legislatures themselves. So this is another very, very important principle which has to be borne in mind when we speak about the floor test or the law connected with floor tests. So one, we are looking at cabinet form of government. We are looking at the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, the titular head being the governor or the president, and fourthly, the concept of judicial supremacy, or rather the judiciary being the final arbiter. Having said that, I now want to place before you some of the important cases, because it's very interesting to note there are perhaps 6 or 7 reported proceedings. And another significant feature in respect of floor tests is that many of them are no more than directions of the court with not much of reasoning. The first of them in the reported line of cases, in fact, the first one which is now often being used in that sense, is the Jagadambika Pal's case. This was a situation sometime in 1998, where from Uttar Pradesh, the sitting chief minister was unseated and another claimant to the office of chief minister was made the chief minister. According to the person who had been removed from the office, he said the incumbent did not enjoy the majority of the house. So what did the court, the matter was brought before the Supreme Court. The court issued various directions for conduct of the floor test in the house. Now, what is important is the court even went to the extent of issuing directions on the manner in which the floor test has to take place. Now, this was one of those cases where the intercession of the court and the direction of the court was spoken about very widely. And there was some criticism of the manner in which the court interfered, and also the modalities which are prescribed by the court. Questions were raised as to whether this was justified at all. But at the end of the day, the direction came to stay and has now become one of the precedents which is being repeatedly followed. The court said, who has the majority of the house is something which can be decided on the floor of the house. And on that rationale, the court said, let the parties have a floor test being conducted. Now, what is important is, in this, the timing of the floor test was something which was becoming very important. The court said the conduct of the floor test must take place immediately. to ensure that nothing else happens by way of any unethical practices. In pretty much the same vein, there was another case, being Anil Kumar Jha's case. That was sometime in 2005, if I remember right. Now, Anil Kumar Jha's case contains a little more reasoning. If someone is interested, you can perhaps make a note of it. It is reported in 2005, 3 SCC 150. Now, again, this was a case where the person who claimed to be having the majority support on the floor of the house, according to one group, was in fact not enjoying the majority, and therefore complaint was brought before the court. Now, the court issued directions by following the same approach which was adopted in Jagadambika Pal's case. Now, this was in fact a situation where even the newly elected members had not even been administered the oath of office. So directions were issued by the court even for administering the oath of office. Then it said that the floor test will have to be conducted. The court also issued consequential directions as to how this will take place so that there is no untoward incident and the floor test is reflective of a congenial atmosphere and a true reflection of the real will and wish of the majority of the house. So this is how the directions took place. Now, this is a second, if I may say so, in the line, and these were cases at the stage of initial formation of government. So to that extent, this is something where there may not be much of an issue, no more than to point out that the court really became the medium, as it were, for immediate conduct of the floor test, because it was apprehended that any delay in the conduct of the floor test would result in unethical practices where the true balance or alignment would get affected by allurement of money or whatever be the other considerations. So to that extent, they are of historical and chronological value. But the bottom line being that these were cases where the court intervened and issued directions. A third is after a lapse of time, sometime in 2017, the earlier one having been in 2005. Now, this was again a case which was at the initial stage of formation of the government. This was in Goa. I think this was that Kavlekar's case. In Goa, a question arose whether someone who had been called to form the government had in fact the majority of the house. All these cases, if one would see, they follow a certain pattern. There is one group which is claiming to have the majority of the house or the majority support of the house in terms of number of members, the numerical strength. There is another group which is opposing it, and there is a doubt being raised. And they being asked to follow the floor test. Now, what intervenes before the floor test and how the floor test comes into the picture is the action of the governor in calling or preferring to call one group to form the government and thereafter establishing its majority in the house with a certain time limit. The doubt, debate, and problem has always been that whenever some group has been called in preference to the other, even though it may not enjoy the majority, and some time is being given to the group to prove its majority after being sworn in, it has always been the experience and the grievance that this results in unethical practices, and therefore the court is asked to step in to conduct an immediate floor test. This is the extent of the court's participation in such cases, where at the initial stage of formation of government, this kind of intervention of the court takes place. Again, this is another case sometime in 2017. Then a case similarly following this pattern is sometime in 2018 in Karnataka, the Parameshwara case. I'm sure all of you would have gone through this. In fact, this has a certain history. In fact, there's only one aspect which I wanted to highlight in this case. There was some kind of a reasoning which was given by the court, where the court said that this is something where it is required to ensure that there is adherence to constitutional principles. Another case, important case, again very recent, is the 2019 case emanating from Maharashtra, the Shiv Sena case. Just in case somebody wants to note down, 2019 10 SCC 809. Now, Shiv Sena case has a little more elaborate consideration of the legal principles and the rationale for ordering the floor test within a certain time frame. In fact, it's very interesting to note that the order starts with the court being conscious of and noting the boundaries, as it were, to be kept between the various organs of the state. The court starts off by saying that there is no gainsaying that the boundaries between the jurisdiction of the courts and the parliamentary independence have been contested for a long time. The court notes that right at the outset. The court says there is a need, however, and requirement for recognizing institutional committee and separation of powers so as to tailor judicial interference in the democratic processes only as a last resort. This is very important. I think this pretty much encapsulates the approach of the judiciary. The court, according to me, has been very careful in ensuring that it does not step on the toe of the other organ or the other constitutional functionaries. But then at the same time, it has to discharge its duty. It has to discharge its constitutional function, which is to ensure that all the organs of the state adhere to their roles and the constitutional values and the constitutional stipulations are not transgressed either in letter or in spirit. In fact, the Maharashtra case, one would recall, had some interesting facts. Now, after the assembly elections were held, there was no particular party which had a majority. The single largest party was called, they were unable to. Then the second single largest party was called, then a third, and it went on, and president's rule was imposed because nobody was in a position to claim that they had the majority of the House and therefore were not willing to form the government and then test their strength on the floor of the House. At which stage, president's rule was imposed. Suddenly, as it were, one fine morning, or if I may say so, one fine early morning, a decision was taken to revoke president's rule. This was sometime at 3 o'clock in the morning, if I remember right. Decision was taken to revoke president's rule, and one particular party was asked to form the government because it had claimed to the governor that they had the majority of the House. The governor said, yes, this party will be sworn in, and that party, the leader of that party, was sworn in as the chief minister, and time was given. About 15 days time, if I recall, was given for them to prove their majority on the floor of the House. The matter was brought before the court. It was said this was unjustified. The action of the governor is something which is unacceptable. And it was said that this grant of time was something which was completely unjustified. It even was argued that the claim of majority, by taking reference to some supports that have been taken from other parties, was not even justified because there was no authorization for the representative of the other party to give any such letter of support. I mean, these are some of the glaring facts which form the backdrop of that case. Court ultimately, after giving some reasoning, directed that a floor test should be held. Of course, as it would turn out, that the person who was sworn in did not really face the test at all. Now, what is important in that case is the court takes reference to various earlier cases, some of the cases which I have now recounted to you. The Karnataka case. The court also refers to the celebrated Bommai case. I have something to say on Bommai's case, as also Ramesh Prasad and one other, Nabam Rebia, which are in a slightly different footing, so I'll deal with them separately. I'm right now, as I was pointing out, talking about the reported case where there was a direction for a floor test to be conducted. Now the court refers, as I was saying, to Bommai's case. Then it referred to the Sarkaria Commission report, the Rajamannar Commission report, and all of them to note that the conduct of floor test is something which is very important, because ultimately the body to decide whether the government, the elected government, is having the support of the legislature or the confidence of the legislature is only the floor of the House and not any other functionary, more so the governor of the state. One other interesting aspect in that case was Article 212 of the Constitution was invoked as a defense. Article 212, you will recall, points out and provides that there can be no interference with the conduct of affairs inside the House and of officers inside the legislative house. The court said whatever is now sought to be interfered with by the court has got nothing to do with Article 212, and that will not be a bar for the court to enter into a discussion and for an order to be passed in the fact circumstances. Court thereafter refers to all these cases, Anil Kumar Jha's case, Jagadambika Pal's case, and all of them, and ultimately directs that the floor test is to be conducted. Now, these are all those cases I was saying, where many of them are really cases where the direction for floor test took place at the stage of initial stage of formation of the government. Now, having said that, we now come to the most recent case, where the court has again gone into the question of floor test and directed conduct of floor test. That is the case arising out of the Madhya Pradesh Legislative Assembly. As coincidence would have it, this was one of the few cases which was heard in open court just before the lockdown commenced towards the end of March, 2 months back. In fact, the recent judgment of the court, where the detailed reasons were given, came out in April after the lockdown had come into place very firmly. Now, this case is very interesting for many reasons. One, this is a case where the discussion on and the direction for floor test took place in respect of a running assembly, a running house. That's very, very crucial distinguishing feature. In fact, one of the arguments for telling the court that there should not be any interference by the court was on the basis that because it's a running assembly, it is really for the house to decide how to decide and how to go about deciding whether there should be a floor test, and if there should be a floor test, when it has to take place. That's why I'm saying the first important distinguishing feature of this case is the fact that it is a running house. What are broadly the facts of this case? The facts of this. And these cases, I may also give you a rider. I have consciously endeavored not to mention the names of the dramatis persona, or for that matter, the parties which are involved. Because one thing I can say for sure, whether it is X or Y dispensation, all parties, one way or the other, depending on their position and presence on either side of the fence or either side of the wall, have always taken opposing positions. If X party is in power, it says that the action taken by the governor or whatever the opposition is trying to do is unjustified. And the Y party says, yes, whatever has taken place is definitely correct. And X party has lost majority and therefore liable to go home or demit office, as it were. Equally, if Y party is in power in some other state, the same position is taken by it as what X has taken, where it is the ruling party, and so on and so forth. And that's the reason why I thought that I should consciously keep away from the parties in terms of identifying them with names or who the persons involved are. Now, coming to the facts of this Madhya Pradesh case. Now, the ruling party was running on a very thin majority. Sometime in the beginning of March, according to the ruling party, there were attempts made to destabilize the running government by luring and whisking away some of its members. In particular, some 22 members, MLAs belonging to the ruling party, were, according to the ruling party, taken away or whisked away by the opposing party to a distant destination outside the state itself. And they were being forced and compelled to resign from the office held by them, namely the membership of the Legislative Assembly. The allegation being that that would result in reduction in the support or the numerical strength of the ruling party in the assembly, and therefore they would lose the majority and accordingly will have to demit office. Now, what is interesting is, therefore, the chief minister of the ruling dispensation writes to the governor of the state saying, we are facing this problem where 22 MLAs, including 6 ministers, have been taken away to a distant place, and it is sought to be made out that they have resigned from their post and they want to resign, and therefore this is something which is not correct. It sought the help of the governor to bring back those people to the home state and to ensure that they are able to interact with the concerned MLAs. Interestingly, the chief minister says, floor test is obviously the most important one which the parties have to go through to ensure that the ruling dispensation is able to demonstrate its continued confidence with the House. The governor writes back. Governor says, I have in fact been apprised that 22 MLAs have resigned from your party and therefore you have lost the majority. An interesting factual feature which I must point out here is the opposition party is, according to the narration of facts in the Supreme Court report, the opposition party and the representatives of the opposition party are the ones who took this factual aspect to the governor and brought it to his notice. Another interesting feature is, as would be evident from the arguments as reported in the decision of the court, is that these persons never went in person before the speaker and handed over their resignations. This is very important. Now, as I was pointing out, the governor, on a review of all these facts, writes to the chief minister saying, it appears that you have lost the confidence of the House. More importantly, the governor says, and the extract of the letter as found in the order says, the governor says that he is confident that the ruling party has lost its majority, therefore you go before the House. In fact, the governor says the budget session is to be started on 16th of March. On that day, it is important that the floor test or the confidence vote is taken up as the only agenda, and he issues directions. On that day, as it would turn out, the House discusses the speech of the governor, gives the thanks to it, and then the House is adjourned to the 26th of March, taking reference to the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. Now, the governor purports to issue directions to the chief minister invoking Article 174 and 175 of the Constitution, saying you must take the floor test within a day. The chief minister writes back saying, no, you don't have the authority to issue such a direction to me. Articles 174 and 175 do not empower you to issue such directions unilaterally to the running government. On the contrary, Article 163 requires that you act only on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, and therefore this direction of yours purportedly under Article 174 and 175 are non-est and cannot be complied with. This is where the stage is set for the rival parties to move the court. The opposition party moves the court seeking various reliefs, one of them being that floor test must be conducted immediately as directed by the governor. The ruling party moves the court with seeking various reliefs. All of them ultimately are declined by the court. But one relief which I must point out, the frame of that relief is something very important for our purposes in terms of constitutional law and jurisprudence. One of the reliefs claimed by the ruling party was that there must be a declaration that the exercise of power by the governor under Article 174 and 175 of the Constitution, calling upon the ruling government to take the floor test, is unjustified and illegal. This, I think, is extremely important. Ultimately, the court says that such a declaration cannot be granted. The elaborate reasoning of the court is something which is very important. Now, having pointed out this factual background, a word or two about the rival contentions. I think that's something which is extremely interesting. Having perhaps, I think I did a mistake in not mentioning to you one other important aspect. Yes, in the meanwhile, the ruling party issues a whip to its members to be present in the House. As all of us would know, a whip has significance and tremendous importance constitutionally because of the provisions of the 10th schedule. A person, a legislator, will be guilty of violating a whip if he does not follow the directions issued by the party, and in fact will be liable to be disqualified if he acts contrary to the whip. That is something which is very important and must be borne in mind. Now, having pointed out these, I will highlight some of the important arguments which were made in that case. The opposition party, as one would understand, argued saying that there must be a direction to conduct the floor test because it is well accepted and recognized that floor test is the surest method of finding out whether a ruling government enjoys the confidence of the House, and therefore there cannot be any delay because that will result in various other undesirable consequences. Now, the ruling dispensation raises certain arguments which are very important and as a matter of law will be very, very significant. The ruling dispensation says, where is the question of the governor issuing a direction under Article 174 of the Constitution? In fact, the speaker takes a specific stand. The speaker says, if there is a direction for immediate conduct of the floor test, the right of the speaker, the authority of the speaker under the Constitution to decide whether any members have suffered disqualification will be taken away. In the words of the speaker, an order directing immediate conduct of the floor test would amount to short-circuiting the powers of the Speaker under the Constitution. Because under Article 190 of the Constitution, whenever a member of the Legislative Assembly resigns, it is for the Speaker to decide whether the resignation is voluntary and genuine. In fact, one interesting aspect I must highlight in this regard. Previously, the position under the Constitution was if one elected member were to give his resignation to the Speaker, then the resignation is complete. However, there was an amendment brought to the Constitution in 1974. I think it was the 33rd Amendment to the Constitution. It said that upon a member resigning and such a resignation being accepted by the Speaker, the resignation comes into effect. Again, very significantly, this amendment itself was necessitated because it was felt that there were various claims of resignation by members under coercion or undue influence. Now, therefore, coming back to the Madhya Pradesh case, the argument of the Speaker was his power to take a decision on the resignation itself was sought to be short-circuited by any direction for conduct of the floor test. Another important aspect is this. It was claimed that this was a running assembly. Being a running assembly, can all the decided cases where there was a direction to hold a floor test apply ipso facto or ipso jure? The argument was that ultimately, if the ruling party has lost its confidence of the House, it is really by the method of a no confidence motion that the matter will have to be sorted out on the floor of the House and not by way of a judicial direction. This was one of the significant argument. A third argument was there is reliance being placed on Bommai's case repeatedly to say that floor test is the ultimate litmus test, as it were. But then Bommai's case was essentially concerned with the exercise of power by the governor under Article 356 for recommending imposition of president's rule in a state. And therefore, that cannot be taken to be an authority for this. Another interesting argument which I have to point out to you at this stage is what was argued by the union. The union government, after taking various other arguments, raised one interesting argument. It said the matter was really part of what is called political questions, whether the decision of the governor to call upon the running government to face the House, to take the floor test within a certain time, whether the Speaker was being given the power or the Speaker's powers were being taken away, what was the justification in such actions being taken by the governor. These are all essentially political questions and the court should not get into it. Now, I'll come to the reasoning of the court on these arguments. It's very important. One, court says the argument that the political questions being involved in the case would preclude it from entering into any discussion or adjudication in the case was not justified. The court said it is very well settled that the court, when considering cases of this nature, is really looking at whether constitutional processes are being followed. The court takes repeated reference to earlier decided cases, various earlier decided cases. It refers to state of Rajasthan case. It refers to state of Karnataka. It refers to other cases and says that ultimately the court will not shy away from looking at any set of facts placed before it if it involved any allegation or grievance of non-compliance with constitutional stipulations in letter and in spirit. That's one important finding of the court. Now, coming to the question of the power of the Speaker being short-circuited. The court says the functioning of the Speaker and the functioning of the governor are two independent mechanisms under the Constitution. The fact that the governor has asked the government to face the floor test will not mean that the Speaker's power is taken away. Court says this will not prevent the Speaker from looking at the issue of disqualification or otherwise of some of the members. In fact, I must point out incidentally, just as a deviation from this case, in 2 or 3 of the earlier decided cases, I pointed out about Jagadambika Pal's case and also the Goa case and I think if I remember right, the Karnataka case. there was an argument that some of the legislators had incurred disqualification, and therefore their participation in the floor test was made the subject matter of dispute in those cases. Ultimately, in those cases, as coincidence would have it, the number of persons involved in that category was such that it did not make a difference to the ultimate result as to who enjoyed the majority or who did not enjoy the majority, and therefore it really didn't matter. In this case also, the court ultimately said the question whether 22 of these persons had incurred disqualification or not may perhaps have a bearing only on their future continuation in the House, or whether they will be entitled to hold any office or not. The court said that cannot stand in the way of the floor test being conducted. That is extremely important because, as I was pointing out, the 22 persons who were involved were MLAs belonging to the ruling party, and 6 of them, in fact, were ministers in the government. In fact, one additional factual feature in that case was that 6 of these ministers who had resigned, their resignation was recommended by the chief minister to be accepted by the governor, and it was accepted, and therefore they ceased to be ministers. And in fact, the speaker had gone on to disqualify those 6 persons, but had not taken any decision in respect of 16 others. Now, I'm highlighting this for one reason. The court was then considering whether the action of the governor in calling upon the government to face the floor test or take the floor test immediately was justified or not. In the process of doing that, the court looks at one important fact. The court notes that the speaker had proceeded to take a decision in respect of the right of the 6 sitting ministers to continue as members, and had proceeded to take a decision on their qualification or otherwise, or on their disqualification, but had not taken any decision in respect of the other 16. And this was something which was curious because all of them were in the same boat according to the court. And therefore, the court took this and few other reasons as the main reason as to why the decision taken by the governor was justified. One other important aspect I must highlight to you in this regard. The court said any decision taken by the governor in this regard is judicially reviewable. That's very important. The court says there must be material for the governor. Whether the decision taken by the governor is something which is reasonable and not perverse, and which is not guided by extraneous considerations, is something which can always be gone into by the court. More importantly, while talking about the role of the governor in such a situation, the court takes very, very poignant reference to how a governor should function and how the polity itself has to function. I was talking about how the argument was raised that political questions cannot really be taken up, and these were cases where such political questions were involved. In fact, the court took great care to note 2-3 important features. One, the court said, when we are looking at these cases, we are looking at whether the constitutional processes are being followed. The court says the governor, while taking a decision, is required to look at the letter and spirit of the Constitution, and it may so happen that the political affiliations are such that the ultimate outcome may be in favor of or against a particular dispensation or a political alignment. That hardly makes a difference. The court is really concerned with the constitutional process and the adherence to the constitutional principles. Now, this is something very important. A third aspect pointed out by the court is whether such actions are justified. Are these correct or not? Should there not be some actions to be taken in respect of such actions? Should there not be cognizance taken of conduct like this? The court says, and I think in a very, very sagacious approach to the whole thing, that's a matter of conscience. That is really for the concerned persons to decide whether what they are doing is right or wrong. If someone were to act on allurement, or if someone were to resist the temptation, is not something where the court beyond a certain stage can take cognizance of. On the contrary, the court is required to look at what the Constitution provides for and ensures that the scheme provided under the Constitution is strictly followed. In fact, I would think that this line of reasoning of the court is where a few issues and perspectives really get thrown up, and I would really throw them in front of you and place it for your consideration and reflection at a much larger level. The court at one stage, when dealing with these arguments, says there needs to be some change in the law, or the law has to evolve to deal with certain unsavory situations. So the first issue, which I really think is very important, is this: can or cannot, or should not be a change in law thought about? This is one very important aspect. Two, the position of governor being what it is, as I had explained earlier. The governors are required to function in a certain fashion. Should or should not there be certain guidelines? I recall Sarkaria Commission recommending the manner in which the formation of government should take place when a governor is called upon to ask a particular party or political grouping to form the government. Now, should there not be some attempt at codifying such situations? In fact, just a word or two about Bommai's case and also Rameshwar Prasad and Nabem Rebia. I think with that, I'll leave you with the reflections so that it is something where there will be some completeness in what I wanted to place before you. Now, Bommai, all of us will recall, is a decision by 9 judges of the Honorable Supreme Court. Bommai's case arose out of actions taken by governors in 6 different states, where there were recommendations for imposition of president's rule. I think 3 important considerations, or if I may say so, headlines of Bommai. It's a very, very, very elaborate judgment running into several hundreds of pages, tends to be diffuse. In fact, one interesting aside I wanted to highlight. Many of these decisions, you take, for example, the Delhi Laws case in 1951. Again, the decision consisted of opinions of all the judges who heard the matter, or a majority of the judges, tended to be diffuse. It required another decision of the Supreme Court in 1955 to clarify what the judgment was. You take the famous Keshwananda Bharati case. 7:6 was the ratio. There are opinions given by the judges which tend to be very diffuse. In fact, a discussion on Keshwananda Bharati case is a subject by itself. That can be the subject of and subject matter of at least 2-3 sessions, at least, if someone were to go into Keshwananda Bharati's case. It bristles with various interesting constitutional issues and political questions. Now, Keshwananda Bharati case, what it said, in fact, in 2 subsequent decisions, Justice Khanna and Justice Chandrachud said what they wanted to say. In fact, there is some debate in some circles. Some critics were to say that it was not for the judges who gave those judgments in the original case to say what it was. You take, coming back to Bommai's case, Rameshwar Prasad's case sets out what Bommai had to say. This is an interesting aside. Now, talking of Bommai, I think 4 important takeaways from Bommai's case. 1, the decision taken to impose president's rule in a state is justiciable. It is something which can be examined by the court on certain recognized parameters and on certain recognized grounds, though they are very restricted. Court said secularism is part of the basic feature of the Constitution of India. Dealing with the role of governor, various discussions took place where the court said the governor functions within a certain framework, and conduct of floor test is something which is very important. These are some of the highlights. Otherwise, as I said, Bommai's case is something which is so diffuse, it may end up requiring a very, very detailed and elaborate consideration. Now, Rameshwar Prasad's case was another interesting case where, again, there were multiple opinions of judges by the Constitution bench. The judges, therefore, went into Bommai's case and gave what was really the reasoning and the ratio in Bommai's case. Rameshwar Prasad's case was again a case where in Bihar there was a hung assembly. Nobody was able to form the government. Therefore, the governor recommended to the president that there must be president's rule. Then, in the meanwhile, some political alignments and realignments took place, and therefore one group of parties said, we will be in a position to form the government. But the governor said, no, this has come about because of allurements of money and other considerations, and therefore this is not healthy for the democracy, and therefore I recommend that president's rule is imposed, and accordingly president's rule was imposed. This was challenged and set aside by the court. But interestingly, there were subsequent developments. In that case, the Election Commission had in the meanwhile, because of lapse of time and passage of time, had started taking steps and made preparations for conduct of fresh elections. And therefore the court said, we will not order status quo. In fact, what is important is this. Bommai says, and Rameshwar Prasad confirms that if the court finds that imposition of president's rule is found to be unjustified and unconstitutional, it will be open to the court to restore the status quo ante. That's very important. Another recent case in 2016 is Nabem Rebiya's case that again arose from extremely interesting and, if I may say so, curious facts which arose in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. A series of developments take place where the ruling government is sought to be destabilized. The governor purports to prepone the assembly session. The members of one grouping get together and hold a session of the assembly, not in the assembly, house of the assembly, but outside, and purport to remove the speaker. They proceed further. In the meanwhile, the speaker who is purported to be removed, he disqualifies some of the members. And that way there is a huge amount of decision making at various levels by various constitutional functionaries which work at cross purposes with each other. High Court says we will not interfere with any of these. Matter comes to Supreme Court. Again, a very elaborate decision of different judges constituting the Constitution bench. They give a judgment where they refer to the speaker, the role of the speaker, the governor, the role of the governor. At the end of the day, what is important is this: the court participates in this process to ensure that constitutional processes are followed. As I was saying, the perspectives which I want to place before you are these. One, the role of the governors. What can be done to ensure that there is adherence to certain guidelines? The role of the speaker. I must point out to you the recent case from Manipur, where the Honorable Supreme Court noted that the speaker being the ultimate authority to decide whether a member of the House is disqualified or has incurred disqualification under the 10th schedule has to be revisited. The court says the past experience has shown that there has to be a relook at the speaker being the arbiter of such petitions and such disputes. Therefore, these are some of the important facets which come out of these cases. These are facets which require reflection and further pondering. And hopefully we will have a fresh look at all of these. And in the days to come, we will be able to have, if I may say so, an approach to these issues where the functionaries work consistent with the objectives and consistent with the dictates and mandates and the letter and spirit of the Constitution. Thank you so much. I leave it to the floor of the House for any questions or anything further.
So thank you very much, sir, for the wonderful session. I think it went on very smooth. Now I call upon the participants. If there's any question, you can raise your hands in the app, or you can just drop a message in the chat box, and we can take up a few questions. Rohan has one question. I'll just unmute him. Rohan, I've unmuted you. Rohan? Okay, I think there's some issue. Aditya Reddy has a question. I'll just unmute him.
Yes, I see something on the screen there. Oh, that's gone off now.
So I'll just
yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So I thought I just had one question. Sir, I may have missed something. So you were referring to a prospective or a probable change of law that may be desirable. I assume you're talking only of the anti-defection laws, sir. Or,
yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. And nothing in the Constitution. That is not the articles pertaining to the governor
No,
or speaker per se.
immediately.
Yes,
I mean, immediately I'm talking about 10th schedule. In that sense, that's part of the
Yes.
constitution.
Yes, I understand. Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Any further questions? So there's one question by Natarajan sir. I think he's having some network issues. I'll just read it out. He's put up in the chat box.
Yes.
So can the manner in which the governor has to act be codified completely?
Yes, that's one of the things I was talking about. In fact, talking of change of law, I mean, immediate issues are
I think the audio got stuck. We will just wait for 2 minutes. Guru sir is rejoined again. I think there's some network issues. Sir, are you able to hear me now?
mute now. Yes.
Sir, we are able to hear you now, sir. I think there were some network issues.
Yeah, there was some network issue. My apology for that.
Yes, sir.
You're able to hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Sorry, there was some question about codification. Yes, that's one of the things I was thinking about. Hello?
Yes, sir. We are able to hear you, sir.
Yes. Now, I think Mr. Natarajan had raised this issue.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, codification of governors' functions. Yes, that's one of the things I think we should preeminently be looking at. Yes, I agree.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah.
I'll just take up one question from Mr. Pramod Chopra. I'll just unmute.
Yes.
Sir, good evening. Pramod here.
Yes.
Sir, why you feel that anti-defection law regarding 10th schedule has to undergo a change? Why you feel it is not effective?
See, there are various issues. See, I spoke about resignations.
True.
Right? In this MP case. We
Yes,
also have the other case which was decided, we came from Karnataka a little earlier, where
yes, sir.
Some members from the ruling dispensation, they purported to resign.
Yes, sir.
And in fact, there is a reported decision of the Supreme Court on that. That is, I think, Balasaheb Patel's case, where
Yes,
these resignations, the factual pattern that all these cases are following is this. These resignations are alleged to be engineered under the instance of the opposing
correct.
dispensation,
Correct.
political dispensation.
Correct.
And one of the aspects which comes into sharp focus is whether these resignations become a tool to overcome the problem of anti-defection law. Because a whip is issued in the meanwhile, you resign and go away. Are you not then escaping the anti-defection law? You understand?
But once you resign, then you resign from the assembly. You are automatically disqualified.
No, the problem is this. If you are a member and you have not resigned, then you suffer disqualification. There is a difference between disqualification and resignation. That is what was elaborately discussed in the Karnataka case. Though one aspect is very important. After all this was discussed and decided by the court, where the court says that you cannot try to overcome a disqualification proceeding by purporting to resign from the membership. But says ultimately, if you are found to be disqualified, the consequence is this: you cannot hold any office until you get re-elected. Therefore, it is only that the person who may have resigned but ultimately is found to be disqualified, he may not be able to take up any office unless or until he is able to contest the election from some other ticket or independently, and is also able to get re-elected. Because the court took reference to Article 174 and 361 in this regard. I think 174 1B, if I remember right. It was Article 174 1B and also 361A, I think, of the Constitution, and said that if a person is found to be disqualified under the 10th schedule, he demits office, but then he can't take up any other office only until he contests another election and gets elected. That's important.
But sir, one more doubt. Sir, one more doubt. Sir, so
Yes.
you are saying that disqualification makes him not to contest. He cannot get it to any post. But resignation
Yes.
also makes him not to be member of the legislature. Therefore, how can he become again? How can he take up any post for profit?
No, the difference is this. The resignation itself is brought about because of allurement. Now, please see the 10th schedule as it stands today. The 10th schedule provides that in 2 contingencies, a person is supposed to have suffered disqualification of defection. One,
Yes,
where he acts contrary to a whip issued by the party to which he belongs.
correct.
2, he voluntarily gives up membership of the party to which he belongs, on whose ticket he is elected.
Correct.
Correct. Now, what he does is to overcome the disqualification proceedings under this act, he simply resigns and gets out of the net. That is one. But having said that, the larger question still remains. Whether in resignation or in disqualification, the consequence is one. The consequence is the person will immediately not be able to take up any office in that sense. Yes.
Correct.
But that is only for a time limit, until the person gets elected. If you can just have a look at Article 361A, I don't know if you are having the Constitution in your hand, just have a look at it, because this is what was interpreted by the Supreme Court in the Karnataka case. If you see Article 361, just give me a minute. I want to look at the Constitution itself and answer. It might be easier for you.
Yes, sir. So I'm not having that Constitution right now, sir.
Yes. Now, if you see that 361 capital B, it is not capital A, it's 361 capital B. A member of a house belonging to any political party who is disqualified for being a member of the house under paragraph 2 of the 10th schedule shall also be disqualified to hold any remunerative political post for the duration of the period commencing from the date of his disqualification till the date on which the term of his office as such member would expire, or till the date on which he contests an election to a house and is declared elected, whichever is earlier. That's important.
Oh, so therefore, resignation will make him to get it from the ruling dispensation any other office, which is not possible if he is disqualified.
Yes, that is one, and he has to get re-elected. There is also 174. In fact, I think if I remember right, in the Karnataka case, the order passed by the speaker disqualifying the members said that they would stand disqualified for the remainder of the term of the assembly session.
Yes.
Which means for the remainder of the house, if it had gone on for 2 years, for the remaining 3 years or something, till that session of the assembly was on. Now, that the court said was not correct. Now, these are all areas where the law needs to be relooked and corrected. It is in that context that I'm saying.
Right, sir.
I hope I made myself clear to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
So nice, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, if time permits, can
Anything
we just
else?
take, there is a request in the chat box. If you can highlight the impact of that, of the 11 members of the present state government's group who abstained from voting in confidence motion vis-a-vis their disqualification. Sir, are you able to hear me, sir? Hello? I think there is again some network issues. I think there seems to be some network issues. I afraid that we will not be able to take up more questions. I'm just waiting for him to enter again, Guru sir. Aparna ma'am.
Yes, I just spoke to Guru.
Yes,
He's
ma'am.
coming back. He's leaving and he's coming back. Just wait for a few minutes.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
I think he's just joined, ma'am. I'm just admitting him.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you now, sir.
My apologies. It's repeatedly getting snapped.
So no problem, sir.
I think Zoom is having enough of me.
No, probably the question which I asked was very sensitive. That's why there was some.
What was the question? Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Can you come back?
Yeah, sir. So there is a request if you can highlight on the current, on the situation or the present Tamil Nadu government's this thing, but from where 11 MLAs abstained from voting.
Now that's a very interesting question. I'm afraid I'll have to duck that question for one reason.
Yes,
I appear for them, so I advise
Yes,
them and
sir.
I appear for them. So
I totally
it won't be
understand.
appropriate. It won't be appropriate, I think, for me to enter into a discussion on that.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir.
I
We will
hope,
take up. No problem, sir.
sorry?
I will just unmute Lakshmanan, sir. I think he wants to ask something.
Yes.
Lakshmanan, sir, I'm not able to unmute him.
Yes, Lakshman. No, classmate Lakshman.
Looks like there is some more. I think he's on. Lakshmanan,
Yeah.
sir, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
It is regarding the later smaller benches clarifying about the earlier larger benches.
What with specific reference to any case?
TMFI, I think that series you missed out. TMFI followed
Yes.
by Inamdar and Islamic
Yes.
Education Society.
Yes.
If you remember, I
Yes.
think the TMFI's position has been totally reversed by the later smaller benches in the in the working of clarifying the earlier bench.
Yeah, I mean that's as I would say, that's a separate subject matter to be discussed. I think as an independent session.
Your impression?
No, I perhaps this may strictly not fall within the parameters of this topic. May not really be necessary in the context of this topic. What we are discussing is my view.
Okay.
Because it may strictly not fall within the parameters of the core issues to be
Okay.
in this topic.
It is an aside question.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Thank you, Lakshman. Thanks.
Sir, one last question we'll take up for the evening, sir. I'll just
Yes.
unmute Charulata.
Yes.
Charu?
Hello.
Hi,
Yes.
Charu.
Sir,
You
good
can ask your question.
Very good evening, sir.
Good
Sir,
evening.
my question is regarding this MP case by Supreme Court on the scope
Which-
of Article 163.
Yes.
It says the discretionary power of the governor can
Yes.
be exercised in this case because the assembly was adjourned, etc., and there was no possibility of moving a no confidence motion.
Yes.
What is your take on it, sir? And there are also constituent assembly debates which say this is discretion is only to take care that the governor is acting in accordance with the other parts of the constitution.
That's correct.
Therefore, what is your take on this discretion aspect decided by the Supreme Court, sir?
No, this
Especially
particular
considering,
case.
yes, sir.
No, my apology. I'm able to roughly understand what your question is. Which is the case that you're talking about? My apologies. I missed out that part of it.
I'm talking about the latest Supreme Court order on the MPs, sir, MP protest.
Yeah, that's the one that I was talking about. That was the one that was the case that I was discussing. I don't know. Perhaps you might have missed some part of what I was presenting to the participants today in the evening. The court looks at the facts of the case and says that such an action taken by the governor is something which is judicially reviewable. If the court finds that the action is not justified, that is, it's perverse or not otherwise reasonable or not constitutional, then the court will interfere. And this governor's discretion is something which is available to the governor in respect of certain areas where he need not act on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. There are various decisions. In fact, I pointed out during my presentation,
Yes,
there are a number of cases on that.
Nabam, Rabia, etc.
Exactly. There are a number of these cases where the article itself, the Constitution itself, Article 163, what you're talking about, specifically provides that the governor shall act on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, save and except where, by or under the Constitution, he can act on at his own discretion.
Yes, sir.
So
Sir,
that is something which is permissible.
Specific query was there's a school
Yes.
of thought which says this discretionary power should be exercised only when the
Yes.
assembly is not in session. I mean,
No.
ordering the that would be
Yes. I'm sorry. My apologies to be interrupting you. No, I was in fact again pointing out as to how one of the arguments was that
Yes.
The MP case was something where it was a running assembly, and unlike other cases, it was not a case where the assembly was not in session. The court still says that the governor can, in fact, go into it. In fact, I would say the court took an extremely balanced and very, very, very wise approach, if I may say so, if I can use that expression, by saying that there has to be a nuanced approach in such a situation if there is a running assembly.
Thank you, sir. Thank
Yeah,
you, sir.
just if you can give me a minute, in fact, I'll try to locate that portion of the order. You can perhaps have a look at it. That
I
may
think
address
you're referring to Justice Chandrachud's portion here.
exactly.
where
That's
he
the one I'm
talks
talking
about.
about, where the court says a nuanced approach has to be taken.
Yes, sir. Point taken, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Just check if it's complete करके रखना.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, with your permissions, I would just invite Aditya Reddy, sir, just to tell a few words, and then we can close this session, sir.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah.
So nothing, sir. We just wanted to thank you on behalf of the Madras Tax Bar for
Yes.
having taken the time out to give such an exhaustive and wonderful presentation. And you covered everything right from the first major case law to even future suggestions for change in the law. I'm sure that any one of us who has any doubt on the subject doesn't have to refer to any commentary anymore. We just have to look at your video in the future also on YouTube. Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks a lot for
Thank
taking
you.
the time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure interacting with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very
Yeah.
much, sir.
Thank
Sir,
you.
as Aditya sir just pointed out, we will be uploading this session on our YouTube channel also.
Sure.
Our YouTube channel is Madras Tax Bar Chennai. So all the participants, if you would have missed out on any portion of this session, you can always access our YouTube channel, and you can always see this webinar anytime. So thank you once again, everyone. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful session.
Thank you.
I thank Aparna ma'am, Srinivas sir, and other members of this Madras Tax Bar for organizing this lecture. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Have a good evening to you.
Yes.
To all the participants, thank you very much. Stay safe, stay home, and take care. Thank you very much. I'm ending the session.
Yes. Thank you.